I'm going to start by acknowledging the country that each of us is on. So I'd just like to say to all of you, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name's Sonia Arndt from the University of Melbourne, and I'd like to just say what an absolute pleasure it is to see you all here. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of us is located. For me, and for some of you, we live and work in Naarm, Melbourne, on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I know many of you are in diverse lands in Australia, New Zealand, in the wider Asia-Pacific areas and beyond. We want to pay our respects to the Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, of all of the lands on which each of us are, and to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'm going to hand over now to PESA President, Associate Professor Mark Tessa, to formally welcome you and open the conference. Mark.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you, Sonia, for this wonderful welcome and acknowledgement of a country. It's my great pleasure as a PESA president to welcome you to this PESA conference. We just spent a good hour and a half in a AGM discussing PESA matters, and it was wonderful to see many of you there. It's also, we discussed at the AGM how many things we can celebrate about our members, its achievements, publications. But one thing that we have also noted, and what I noted in my president's report, is that what we've been lacking is face-to-face engagement. It's since December 2018 that we last been together in Rotorua at our face-to-face conference. And we're really hoping that this is our last online conference. And we're really grateful that we have this online conference. And I have to say that Sonia, Bernadette, Carl. So what I wanted to say is that we're really grateful that we are here together in this online conference, because if you may recall that in August, we had the Pisa Midwinter Zoom Fest. It's been very successful mini conference that Sonia has organized. And it's been sort of our testing the waters, whether there is an interest and whether there is a space for us to think about that we could be engaging somehow in an online space, knowing already that most likely face-to-face engagement at the end of the year won't be possible in 2021. And I'm just really grateful that you are all joining us. And we have a very exciting program. We have very exciting keynote addresses. We have a very exciting presentations. And we have also some very special celebrations that we will have today. And with that, I would like to thank again Sonia and the team for organizing the conference. And I will hand over to you, Sonia, to give us some housekeeping.
Thank you, Mark, for that welcome. So I think in terms of housekeeping, you can see from the program that which will have come with your Zoom links that you got to enter into this room, that we have some celebrations to come first. Then we have our keynotes. So we have Professor Andrew Gibbons and Melita Hogarth as our keynotes. And then we have our Zoom rooms. So I'm going to be stepping you through the program throughout the conference. We're going to start off with our celebrations. And the first celebration will be of scholarships. So can I just remind people to stay on mute unless you're speaking? And I'm going to ask Carl Mika to talk to the scholarship awards.
Thank you, Sonia. Before I announce the winner of this year's PESA Scholarship, I'd just like to say a few things about the scholarship itself. Up to 2 scholarships can be awarded each year, each to the value of $10,000 Australian. The criteria that have to be met are the extent of the philosophical content, the sophistication of argument, the argument has to be cogent, the thesis has to be original, there has to be depth and mastery of philosophical material, There has to be a contribution that it makes to philosophy of education or education theory. And there has to be a description of how the project extends, completes, or adds to other publications and projects that the applicant may have been involved in. I'm very pleased to say that Sarah Gurr meets all those criteria and is the recipient of this year's PESA Scholarship Award. I'd just like to say a bit about Sarah's research. Her supervisors are Dr. Daniela Forster, University of Newcastle, and Professor Tom Griffiths, Oslo Metropolitan University. The title of her thesis, at least at this stage, is Ethical Dilemmas and Moral Uncertainties for Environmental and Sustainability Educators at the Australian Coalface. In her application, she describes her research in the following way. My research is an exploratory inquiry into ethical, normative and epistemic tensions in environmental and sustainability education, ESE. It endeavours to map these tensions and translate them to the context of Australian fossil fuels communities. In doing so, it seeks to explore the particular ethical dilemmas that arise for educators when exploring how, if at all, they should provide ESE in these contexts. This research is informed by policy analysis, autoethnographic reflection and philosophical investigations, and seeks to develop a rich contextual normative case study that may provide teachers pedagogical support in navigating these ethically complex tensions. Just a few words about the quality of her proposal and her thesis. We really appreciated the quality of research put into the proposal, and this showed us that there was a great deal of coverage of the field at such an early stage. We were also impressed on the scholarships committee that the thesis will draw on a number of approaches, but doesn't abandon a philosophical approach at any stage. If there is a strongly descriptive element, we noticed it seems that it will be brought back quickly to a more rigorous, thoughtful discussion. Of course, the research is original too, so that always helps. Sarah has undertaken a theoretically sophisticated proposal, which will contribute directly to educational theory. Her research looks to be quite specifically focused, but with application in various contexts. So with those few words, I'd like to congratulate Sarah and her supervisors on what I'm sure will be a fantastic PhD journey. Well done.
Sarah, congratulations, first of all. Fantastic, fantastic achievement. And the beautiful thing today is that Sarah is also one of our moderators in the Zoom rooms later on. So it's perfect, and we can all celebrate you throughout the conference, Sarah. Fabulous work. So next we're going to move on to the Book Awards. The Book Awards committee is Taylor Webb, Daniela Forster and myself. So we're going to start off with Taylor saying a little bit about the awards themselves, and we're each going to say a little bit about the books that have been reviewed this year.
Hi, everyone. Good day. My name is Taylor Webb. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver in Canada. Like Sonia, before I speak to any of the books or the award itself, I just would like to begin by acknowledging the land in which I'm located on today. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. This large area where I'm speaking from today is interrupted by the colonial borders that circumscribe southern British Columbia in Canada and very large regions of Washington State in the United States. Just to give you a sense of where I'm from. I hope that my too brief land acknowledgement impresses upon the global reach of colonialism and the continuing efforts to interrupt these historical and contemporary global forces. And just like Sonia, I'd like to acknowledge the PISA Book Award Committee, including the outstanding efforts of Chair Dr. Sonia Arndt. There's misspelling in mine, it says Arendt. I think it thinks you're Hannah. And the brilliant insights by Dr. Daniela Forster. Thank you both for your hard work on this committee and bringing such good humor to the committee. Thank you both. With regards to the PISA Book Award, PISA recognizes the importance of authored and edited books in advancing knowledge in the philosophy of education. The publication of a book is often a key milestone in an academic's career. The PISA Book Awards have been established to acknowledge the significance of selected books published by PISA members each year. The criteria for the award are related to academic rigor, scholarly significance, originality, insight, and the contributions to advancing ideas in the philosophy of education. As Sonia mentioned, Sonia, Daniela, and myself acted as the judging panel for this year's awards. I'm just going to briefly introduce the titles and the authors of each of the 3 books that were submitted this year for competition. And then each of the members of the committee will speak a little bit more, albeit briefly, yes, to each of those books. So the 3 books were this year. One was entitled Beyond Virtue, The Politics of Educating Emotions by Dr. Liz Jackson. The second was entitled Beyond Learning in the Era of Globalization, co-authored by Masamichi Ueno, Yasunori Kashiwagi, Kayu Fuji, Tomoyo Saito, and Taku Murayama. The third book is Maori Philosophy, Indigenous Thinking from Aturau. And I totally mispronounced that, and my apologies. That was written by Georgina Torrey Stewart. I'm still learning other parts of colonialization and indigenous languages elsewhere. As a committee, we wanted to speak to each of these fantastic texts and their significant contributions to the philosophy of education. And I'm going to speak just real briefly before I hand it off to my fellow members about Liz Jackson's book. I hope you all know Liz Jackson. She's right up there on top of my screen. Hi, Liz. Liz Jackson is professor at the Education University of Hong Kong. Her book, Beyond Virtue, The Politics of Educating Emotions, critically analyzes the pedagogies involved with educating emotions. The focus, refreshingly, is not just on the psychological benefits of emotional regulation, but also on how calls for educating emotions can connect to the aims of society and perhaps to a more just society. The book is timely, insightful, and very well written. The book explores psychology's understanding of emotions, and particularly the politics of emotions, and connects these very clearly to ideas of philosophy throughout. It includes several important and engaging chapters that address ideas about education, including ideas about education for happiness, compassion, gratitude, resilience, mindfulness, courage, vulnerability, anger, sadness, and fear. I have no doubt that that this book will make significant contributions to the philosophy of education and to teaching more generally.
And before I move on, I just have to say that this really is one of the most wonderful committees to be a part of, because you get such fabulous resources that you have to read. So the title of the second book that we reviewed, which I'm going to talk to, is the one titled Manabi in Japanese Schooling, Beyond Learning in the Era of Globalization, co-authored by Masamichi Ueno and his colleagues. This book introduces the basic purpose and significance of Japanese and East Asian education through the concept of Manabi. It clarifies the educational history and philosophy of the East in relation to, for example, to self-formation and perfection of character, and to study its concrete practices. And it offers insights into the particularity of Manabi as a new perspective in the context of progressive education. Positioned as a new perspective, though, Manabi's long history elevates it above any kind of what we might call a trial. This book is a crucial, refreshing, and timely engagement with the notions of learning through concepts such as nothingness, selfness, emptiness, no-mindedness, teaching and learning without words, and body-mind that break down dominant assumptions, rhetoric, and dualisms that remain common in the Western conceptions of learning, but that in the history of learning in a global sense are definitely not new. So I absolutely recommend that this book is something that everybody can learn from, and definitely I did. I'd like to hand over now to Daniela.
Thank you so much, Taylor and Sonia. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which the University of Newcastle is seated, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I extend this acknowledgement to the Awabakal and the Wurundjeri people of the land on which I live, learn and work, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. It's been a real absolute pleasure to work with Sonia and Taylor on the Book Awards Committee. Thank you so much. Your insights and humour and wonderful commitment to this work has been fantastic. I'm going to be talking about Georgina's book. So it is with pleasure that the Book Awards Committee bestow the 2021 PESA Book Award to Dr. Georgina Tori Stewart for her excellent book, Maori Philosophy, Indigenous Thinking from Aotearoa. This excellent text provides insightful contributions to the field of world philosophies of education. The Book Awards Committee highly recommend it to all. Georgina presents us with an act of scholarly protest to think with Maori cognitive resources, to protect and advance Maori philosophical integrity, and to be constantly vigilant against colonising attitudes and language. This book is especially useful for educational purposes, interrogating key ideas in Maori philosophy and offering insightful learning opportunities for readers. Georgina's translational work presents a Maori-centric vision demonstrating the many layers of meaning in this complex Indigenous worldview, bringing connections with Maori feminism, environmental virtue ethics, and relational ethics of infinite responsibility to enrich the intercultural project. This book is a challenge to willful ignorance about the complexity and philosophical capacities of Indigenous worldviews. Finally, I would like to celebrate all our Book Award contenders today, and especially to acknowledge and celebrate the writing work of all our PESA members. Whether you have published this year, or if you're in the process of writing and thinking at any stage, a doctoral thesis, a paper, a special issue, or scoping out a book. Thank you for your contribution, and we encourage you to put your future books forward to the awards. I will like to offer Georgina an opportunity to speak, and then I would also like to offer Sarah an opportunity to respond to her scholarship award. So Georgina, would you like to say a few words at all?
Tēnā koutou. I'm really humbled and I'm quite overwhelmed actually for the award. So thank you very, very much. Particularly when I listened to the other two books that were in the running, I started to think that I really didn't have much of a shot. So once again, kia ora, tēnā koutou. Thank you very, very much indeed.
I would also just like to say thank you so very much for this. Like Georgina, I'm also feeling quite overwhelmed. This has been a particularly difficult year for me, and I think this is a really nice reassurance that what I'm doing is good work and important work, and just a nice little validating hug in a very isolating time that we'll experience. So thank you very much.
Congratulations again to both of you. Fantastic. It's fantastic to be in a position to be able to give awards out to the amazing work that we get to review. And yeah, I'd like Daniela's just said, I'd really welcome and encourage everybody to submit their work, PhD students, as well as people who have written or are writing books. I'd like to hand over now to Mark again to just speak to those two new PESA fellows whom we've just approved at the AGM.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you, Sonia, for handing over to me. And it's as a president of PESA, it's my pure pleasure and privilege to be leading this segment. We just, as I mentioned in my president's welcome, we just came from AGM where we have approved 2 new PESA fellows. And for those of you who haven't been part of AGM or are new to PESA, becoming a PESA fellow is what we call an ultimate recognition of a distinguished contribution to the society or to a philosophy of education. And we don't take this, we don't give this PESA fellowship too often. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the last time we had a PESA fellow appointed was in 2014. So you can see how special they are and how amazing this year is that we actually have 2 new PESA fellows. And it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce them to you just very briefly and perhaps just a little bit personally. You all know them, and they've been part of PESA Society for years. First is Liz Jackson. Liz has been serving the society as a member representative, as a vice president, as a president of PESA. She's been member of exec, leader of multiple projects. She's deputy editor of EPET, and I think it was in Taiwan, Liz, that was your first conference we joined, where the EDG started and which you co-led. Liz has also organized a 2019 conference in Hong Kong that we still hope we're going to have again sometime. Everything was ready, and we think that we can restart when we can, planning that wonderful occasion and that special boat ride in a Hong Kong Bay. Liz is a great philosopher of education. She's a great scholar. She has published and edited extensively in her field. She's always willing to collaborate. She's a professor, she's a colleague, she's a friend, and she's a really lovely human being. And with that, it's my great pleasure and privilege to congratulate you, Liz, on your appointment as a PESA Fellow in recognition for your outstanding contribution to the society and to the philosophy of education field. Thank you, Liz.
Yes, thank you so much. It really is an honor. I don't know about everyone coming back to Hong Kong, but PESA's been such a big part of my life for ever since I came to Hong Kong. You're right. The first year I came to Hong Kong, I went to Taiwan to go to PESA. At that point, I only knew Michael and Tina. It's really been a family for me over the years, and I know Mark, I know it's hard to take a leadership role when we're just faces on a screen and words on a page, but you've done a great job to make us all feel connected to each other. And as soon as Hong Kong lifts its quarantine restrictions, I'll be down there trying to barge into your Australia, New Zealand bubble. I don't know when that's going to be. It might be another few years at this rate with the situation here. Miss you all. Thank you. It's really an honor. And I'm very touched because I think this is an honor that would go to someone far more senior and grown up and old than me. I feel a little bit old now just because it's 9 in the morning. But in general, I don't feel like I'm old enough and senior enough to deserve such recognition and praise. But it also gives me energy and inspires me to try to contribute more in the future. So I'm not going to retire next year, rest assured. As long as I'm trapped here in Hong Kong, I'm going to be a little bit bored and missing all of you. So we'll keep the collaborations ongoing in various ways. So thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much to my colleagues.
Thank you, Liz, and congratulations again on this well-deserved award. And just as a reminder, from now on, you can write under your name FPESA. So that's another thing that you get with this PESA fellowship. I forgot to mention that. And with that, I will move to our second newest PESA fellow, and that's Andrew Gibbons. And Andrew's been around sort of always and forever as part of the PESA. He's responsible for many of us to joining PESA, always encouraging us to come to PESA conferences. Andrew's been incredibly always supporting and being with others with students, not only his, but any student, so to speak, at the conference, in a pub after the conference was over often. And it's been, when Andrew sees someone at the conference being alone, he joins them, and he brings a collegial, caring, intellectual spirit to our annual meetings. Andrew organized multiple PISA conferences. He served on PISA exec. He's been a PISA secretary. He published extensively. Andrew is a professor, but he would say that he's an early childhood teacher first, most likely. He's a humble colleague who never pushes himself forward. Andrew, I congratulate you on your well-deserved appointment as a PISA Fellow in recognition of your outstanding service and contribution to the scholarship. Andrew, the screen is yours.
Kia ora, Mark. I'm about to do some speaking, so I was wondering if, other than saying thank you, I might be allowed to weave some thanks to the society and to my colleagues into a session on conspiracy theory, thinking perhaps it's a conspiracy that I was nominated. But before that, I just want to say also, one of the awesome things about this experience is to, in some ways, share it with Liz. We share many awesome times as exec members and as participants in conferences, and so this is another excellent part of the narrative, and part of the PISA narrative is to have things to share and to look back on together. So I'll disappear now, but there'll be a few more thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, and congratulations again on your well-deserved appointment as a PISA Fellow. And again, you can start using FPISA after your name, and we expect to see it in part of your email signature. Sonia, I think that concludes my segment. Over to you.
Fabulous. Congratulations, both of you. I can't even get the words out. It's really, really an honor and so well-deserved for both of you. Also, as Andrew said, he's going to speak, so it's my honor as well to introduce Andrew as our first keynote speaker. Professor Andrew Gibbons is, as Mark says, an early childhood teacher. He's a teacher educator. He's a professor at the School of Education at Auckland University of Technology in Auckland, and the title of his keynote is When Good Conspiracy Theories Go Bad. So, Andrew, over to you and your keynote.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. Welcome to this keynote from Tamaki Makaurau. Oh, sorry, Kevin, you've got something? Oh, sorry, I would love to acknowledge Kevin's waving his hand. Is it okay if we just interrupt the start of the keynote?
I'm unmuted. Sorry, I can't see the screen there, but I just wanted to say, as the first ever PISA Fellow and somebody who has been using me as a post-nominal, I would like to congratulate Liz and Andrew very much for joining the little group, and I am honoured to find somebody or two people who, with such brilliance, to become fellows. So congratulations very much to both of you.
I feel like I can drop the mic now, actually. I might just walk off stage. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about conspiracy theory. As I was saying, I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we're just coming out of one phase of lockdown and moving into another, and those are some of those moments that heighten our sense of feelings of how we and how our communities are engaging with COVID-19, with governmentality, and with a sense of community. So that's the context within which I'm talking about when good conspiracy theories go bad. Keynotes of conspiracy theories ring out across the lands, lending a feel to the pandemic. Theories about conspiracy theories challenge the discordant tendencies of conspiracy theorists, searching for the appearance of conditions that seem ideal for the amplification and resonance of thoughts about conspiracies. I ask myself, COVID-19, sorry, excuse me. Like Liz, I feel young, but something about my eyes is telling me I'm getting older. I ask myself, COVID-19, how does it feel? Well, I feel grumpy, but I don't feel grumpy about the virus. I feel grumpy about the absurdities that play out during the virus. One of those absurdities that makes me feel most grumpy concerns conspiracy theories. I'm not so much grumpy because conspiracy theories exist. I'm grumpy because I like conspiracy theories. And now, in this pandemic, conspiracy theories are not very cool. It doesn't feel very good that conspiracy theory has become uncool. It's my generational entitlement as an X. And hold on, I have a little prop that I promised some people. I didn't test the prop out with the microphone and the headphones, so there's a major flaw in it. So my little tin foil hat might fall apart at some stage. And that looks all right. So growing up in the 70s and the 80s, conspiracy theories nurtured feelings in me of political and intellectual action in my young mind. It revealed a status quo to be challenged, protests to march, and ironic songs to sing about this nation's myths of happiness, fairness, and inclusivity. In the 2020s, I now have to wonder about the truth of these adolescent feelings. That doesn't feel very comfortable when watching so-called conspiracy theorists march for freedom, when the version of freedom being protested seems to me to be a very, very narrow version of it. It makes me grumpy to sing about this nation's myths of happiness. It makes me grumpy to see what those marches have done to the art of theorizing conspiracy. So I'm interested in talking about how I feel about conspiracy theories and to think through conspiracy theories and education with a view to making a case for the reclaiming of conspiracy theory as a productive approach to questions that concern the philosophy of education. I'm going to start by exploring notions of good and bad conspiracy theory, and then I'll take a look at some educational experiments that intersect with conspiracy theory. And in conclusion, I'll consider some academic conspiracies. So I'd like to start with the appearance of what I'm calling, although albeit very simplistically, bad conspiracy theory. A pandemic-fueled rise in conspiracy theories has at the same time fueled writing on conspiracy theory, exploring the natures, causes, and implications. In theorizing conspiracy theory, particular attention turns to a technological disruption that was not at our fingertips in the 1970s and 80s. Unless, of course, there was a government and technological industry conspiracy to keep Web 2 social media technologies hidden from all of us at the time. And maybe they would have done that for good reason. The concern now is that social media contributes to the possibility of a new conspiracism. This new conspiracism is a version of conspiracy theory that is even less theorized than your average conspiracy theory. The currency of a new conspiracism generates a concern for the capacity of social media to accelerate the transmission of a crazy or dangerous idea with not even a whiff of a fake fact to lend it legitimacy. Just an unsubstantiated, almost random claim aimed at amplifying uncertainties and disconnections. In a paper submitted to this conference, Georgina Stewart observes the transmission of these untheorized and unsubstantiated ideas, in which ignorance and knowledge mesh together, serving as, in Georgina's words, a stringent lesson about the limits of national learning capacity. Social media untruths, Georgina suggests, hold an inherent advantage over truth. They can be made to seem simple and plausible, whereas comprehensive explanations of socio-scientific phenomena, such as the current pandemic, are invariably extremely complex. There's an important distinction to explore here in terms of knowledge and ignorance. The label conspiracy theorist doesn't seem at the moment to distinguish between those who produce a theory and those who follow it. It also doesn't distinguish between those who produce a theory because they thoroughly need to believe in it and those who produce theory because they thoroughly believe in disorientation and discord. With regard to the former, conspiracy theory theorists have tended to regard the conspiracy theorist as engaging in a form of cognitive failure that is highly committed to a particular belief and will perpetually produce new theories to maintain that belief. In this new age of conspiracism, actors produce and disseminate claims regarding more or less imaginative conspiracies, knowing full well these claims are entirely fake, distributing seeds of discontent throughout the social media and with malign intentions. In this conspiracism, there is no need to defend a theory. The main aim is to get as many conspiracies growing as possible. If some do not take root, there's no feelings of loss to have to engage with. The cool days of harmless and even perhaps entertaining conspiracy theories are over. The winter of conspiracy theories has come, and its coming has largely been overlooked in the study of education. Perhaps worse than that, education systems are centrally responsible for these dark days. In a forthcoming editorial on public pedagogy, an editorial that ends with an essential question for teachers, Michael Peters argues that, and I quote, "A lack of knowledge does not inhibit people. And more than this, there's a willingness to take up positions that are often in direct contradiction to the results of established research." Michael continues, "The sheer weight of accumulated evidence in the assessment of conspiracy, while essential in establishing the truth of the matter, may do little to change minds. Sometimes counter-evidence simply strengthens erroneous belief." Responding to a conspiracy theory with the facts overlooks the ways in which conspiracies and conspiracy theories are affective, how senses of the covert and unjust use of power, senses of uncertainty, and senses of not belonging actually feel. A critical role for the philosophy of education is then to explore the ways in which feelings of certainty and belonging are produced, and for what purposes. A paradox evident with conspiracy theories is that they more or less intentionally leverage uncertainty and leverage disconnection by offering the promise of connection and certainty. There is an association here between melancholia and crises and conspiracies to make sense of. Georgina explains that studies show how people become more susceptible to propaganda and extremist politics when they are socially isolated, and offers that life online might be one manifestation of this social isolation. At the same time, life online appears to be a way to form a sense of togetherness through believing in government and big pharma conspiracies with regard, for instance, vaccines and such. Life online then is like liquefaction pouring through the cracks that appear in community. This tinfoil hat is getting really warm. I'm sticking with it. It's clear in the literature on conspiracy theory that while there's a significant and justified concern for the impact of conspiracy theory at this time, there's also at the same time a concern to protect conspiracy theory from an association with conspiracism and to take care to question the stigmatization of conspiracy theorists. Clark, for instance, argues that although conspiracy theorists do commit a cognitive error that leads them to prefer theories that are otherwise less plausible over theories that are otherwise more plausible, the activities of the conspiracy theorists are not to be condemned outright. The prevalence, Clark continues, of conspiracy theorizing is beneficial to us in several ways. Let's explore how. There are good conspiracy theorists out there who engage in detecting conspiracies for the good of communities. There are individuals and groups dedicated to exploring and revealing patterns and effects that the majority of the population remain ignorant to, and concerned with the hidden uses of power. And sometimes they reveal actual conspiracies by actually powerful conspirators, all the while more or less unintentionally contributing to the discourses of political openness, transparency, and balance, and by inviting people to take evidence seriously and to be attentive to how things are explained. Clark defends that if a non-conspiratorial social explanation is better articulated as a result of the challenge of a conspiracy theory, then that is all to the good. So, when a conspiracy theory reveals an actual conspiracy, it's an example of a good conspiracy. theory, good conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theories can also be good even when they turn out to be flatly and obviously wrong, but have motivated more questions as to an apparent certainty or assumption that was worth rethinking or retesting. Good conspiracy theories are good when they reveal something that keeps getting ignored. For instance, a persistent ignoring of the failure of education system to address experiences of equity and belonging. While, as Michael argues, and I quote, conspiracy theories are unlike science in that they are not open to rebuttal on the basis of evidence or argument, in the sense that there's no accepted procedure for testing or truth validation, this does not make them useless. It means we read them differently. We read them like we read a poem, or a great science fiction short story, or a novel, or a film, or even a terrible science fiction plot, but one that demands thinking and feeling. Philippa knows what I mean there. So what follows is a few short educational experiments using conspiracy theories. Experiment 1. Can I do my own research? What does I did my own research on vaccines offer for Rancière's thinking on the principle of intellectual equality? Right now, the I did my own research movement might take comfort in Rancière's thoughts on discovering that we, as intellectually equal, can teach ourselves without the intervention of another. But Rancière should not have had to spell it out that the principle of being equally able to teach oneself does not mean that we cannot also equally fool ourselves. Perhaps the reminder here is that Rancière was testing the principle of emancipation and inviting teachers to test that notion. We might also look through Rancière at the ways in which conspiracy theories reveal tensions in traditionally hierarchical explicatory relationships. It's not just social isolation and anxiety that nurtures conspiracy theories. So too do hierarchies of knowledge. This problem of authority has been evident in a public misinformation campaign that the Ministry of Education in Aotearoa, New Zealand, has channeled through early childhood education centre communities. Since 2020, the Early Childhood Centre has emerged as a new official channel for countering the effects of conspiracy theories. The Ministry of Education has encouraged early childhood centres to send out official messaging, prepackaged official messaging, in order to counter the spread of misinformation. This led to a range of communications focused on what information to trust and how to manage the flow or flood of information from at times competing sources. This targeted approach is even more targeted because it polices some communities as more susceptible to conspiracy theories than others. And these communities are the same communities that the Ministry of Education, for 2 decades, has strategically attempted to force into the non-compulsory education sector of early childhood. On 21 August last year, the Secretary of Education introduced a nationwide bulletin for the sector with a comment that it was, and I quote, particularly disappointing that not only have we had to deal with a resurgence of COVID-19, but also rumours and misinformation. The ministry put significant emphasis into combating what it called dangerous rumours. We continue to see misinformation circulating on social media and other forms of media regarding medical testing. The rumour of particular concern is that children will be taken away from families if they or their family test positive for COVID-19. The bulletin then stated, it is a priority that the child remain safely in the care of their parent or caregiver. Now, to say that a thing is a priority is actually not the same as saying it will not happen. So the bulletin itself does not dispel the rumour, but rather just restates a policy. Through Rancière, then, we might open up some conversations as to how the production of knowledge hierarchies does not diminish, but rather amplifies conspiracism on account, perhaps, of a legacy of educational colonization and epistemological chauvinism that determines who belongs and who does not, or who is yet to be annexed to the mainstream educational systems. Right, experiment 2, imagination, science fiction, and education. Last week, my friend Soma concisely articulated that there's a lot of unhappy, bored people in Aotearoa whose connection with a conspiracist community has been strengthened by an opportunity to fear for their freedom at this time. Michael explores this phenomenon globally, arguing that there is a core of political, e.g. hard republicanism, and or religious, white fundamentalist Christianity beliefs that act as the interpretive schema and often the more outlandish and more censored or suppressed by government agencies, the greater a sense of persecution and the greater the feelings of righteousness. I don't feel excited by the idea of working with hard Republicans and white fundamentalist Christians in order to, as Georgina invites, work intelligently and compassionately together for the good of us all. But I'm an early childhood teacher, so I'm pedagogically and philosophically equipped to give it a go. Working intelligently and compassionately requires some imagination, perhaps even the same kind of imagination that is necessary for the curation and application of conspiracy theories, a freedom of imagination that cannot be overlooked. More than this, the function of imagination and the experience of having one's imagination disciplined through the functions of education systems might be worth exploring in relation to what it means to feel connection and disconnection, belonging and isolation. And I think this is where science fiction might have something to offer. On science fiction as method, Ursula Le Guin emphasizes the beautiful opportunities for exercising with the unimaginability of the universe, all the time connected deeply to that which is present. Le Guin is not talking about the space opera with the chiseled space goon zipping around, blasting conspiring space aliens, but rather stories that venture to the horizons of imagination, challenging a humanist failure to imagine being differently. Now, while even those militaristic neo-Western science fiction stories offer something for a study of conspiracy theories and education, I'd like to sidestep them right now and consider some ways that the movie Interstellar by Christopher Nolan might contribute to thinking about education, imagination, and science. If you haven't seen Interstellar, there are a few spoilers. In Interstellar, the educational function of conspiracy theories is imagined quite specifically in a classroom event, or at least in the principal's office. Is it where we'd see a dialogue between a former NASA pilot and the child and his child's high school teacher. The teacher explains that school textbooks have been corrected. The truth is that there was no moon landing. The teacher is nonetheless patriotically proud of the moon landing because it was an effective piece of propaganda that bankrupted the then Soviet Union in its efforts to win the space race. The teacher explains that now, that is in the future, with the truth revealed, to talk of moon landings is a conspiracy theory that distracts children from their predicament on Earth. A predicament that requires their commitment to caring for a dying planet, a planet dying in part because of the anthropocentric hubris of organizations like NASA. Interstellar is then a device for effectively engaging both teachers and students with conspiracy theories, and in an ironic way on account of the way that the theory is flipped by the education system for the purposes of governing the energies of communities to care for the planet. In Interstellar, teachers are conditioned to transmit a message that NASA and its space scientists are not just emblematic of a modern industrial planetary disaster, but also in some way to blame for both the planet's physical needs and for human psychological needs. The narrative then also invites questions concerning how to feel about science. The problem of trusting science emerges later in the narrative when it turns out that the lead professor, who has been working on an equation to solve the problem of gravity in order for all humanity to escape a dying Earth, admits that he had long since given up on solving that equation, and that he was only pretending to be working on solving it so that he could convince people to continue to work towards the only tenable plan, known as Plan B, which involved a few astronauts and a lot of human embryos travelling through a wormhole as the future of humanity. The scientist, Professor Brand, in tears, finally admits that he's lied, leaving us to wonder about the scientific lies that punctuate our existence. Georgina's paper engages with this mistrust of science, research and experts, and recognises, and I quote, causes such as the public gradually and increasingly finding out how they or we have been harmed and misled for many decades about various claims involving experts and scientists and science. The disasters caused by applications of science, Georgina argues, are legion. Some scientists, recognising this loss of faith in science and scientists, lament that the fault of this distrust actually lies with science fiction, which might be another reason to argue for science fiction. But these scientists go as far as to conspire that a renewed faith in science could be produced by rewriting science fiction to tell stories of the greatness of science. If that is indeed the case, then definitely a class in how to detect a scientist's attempt at massaging popular opinion through science fiction will be essential in a conspiracy theory curriculum. So, experiment 3, a conspiracy theory curriculum. Just before the pandemic, Douglas et al. Theorized the tendencies to theorize conspiracies. These tendencies include the preservation of beliefs in the face of uncertainty and contradiction, an overestimation of the ability to understand complex causal phenomena, being bored, feelings of marginalization, and a lack of agency. Add to this the belief that someone out there has immense and hidden reserves of power at their fingertips, and that there's no such thing as a random event. Just these few tendencies seem to beg to be content in a new conspiracy theory learning area of the New Zealand curriculum, in which students engage imaginatively with all these tendencies. At university, this curriculum already exists in philosophy of education papers. Here's what Jim Marshall used to teach us in his classes. This is a quote. Foucault believes that in the West and essentially post-Enlightenment, we have produced and disseminated various discourses and associated practices which, whilst professing truth to be their aim, in fact mask their true function, which is not the will to knowledge, but the will to power. Professing to be advancing truth in the development and circulation of such discourses, specific powers are attained and used to produce certain effects. Could a curriculum that introduces this kind of thinking open up rich veins of thinking about and questioning those aforementioned conspiracy theory tendencies? Jim's curriculum offered many questions and a particular way to be with a question that might help us at this time of COVID-19. Prophetically, he asked, and this is 1997, how, in democratic liberal democracies, are we to reconcile the interests of states and the interest of the individuals? He also asked, what is the acceptable level of surveillance of the state? And how do we treat our brothers and sisters of Indigenous and of different ethnicity from what, in my case, that's Jim writing, in New Zealand is still mainly a population of British descent, of British institutions and British political philosophy? These questions that Jim shared seem to belong not just in a university philosophy of education paper, but also in the school curriculum. I wonder what school would feel like if the curriculum had showed more encouragement for teachers and students to practice asking these questions 20 years ago. I would also like to advocate, unsurprisingly, for this conspiracy theory curriculum to work more closely with the strands and principles of Te Whāriki, the early childhood curriculum. How, for instance, might the weaving of the curriculum strands and principles open up different ways to think about what a curriculum offers, the freedom to imagine the unimaginable, and the ways in which knowledge and ignorance intersect with belonging? Jim also introduced students to the philosophical contributions of literature through, for instance, the writing of Albert Camus. Through Jim's sharing of the ethics of Camus, our curriculum revealed more questions questions concerning science and art, concerning difference and belonging, and concerning how to engage with a world that does not make sense. So in conclusion, 1960, January the 5th in the New York Times, we read, Paris, January the 4th, Albert Camus, one of France's leading literary figures, was killed today in an automobile accident. He was 46 years old. In 2011, in The Guardian, we read, 60 years after the French Nobel laureate Albert Camus died in a car crash at the age of 46, a new book is arguing that he was assassinated by KGB spies in retaliation for his anti-Soviet rhetoric. Italian author Giovanni Catelli first aired his theory in 2011, writing in the newspaper Corriere della Sera that he had discovered remarks in the diary of the celebrated Czech poet and translator Jan Zabrana that suggested Camus' death had not been an accident. Now Catelli has expanded on his research in a book titled The Death of Camus. Camus, critical of intellectuals and an advocate of ordinary lives. Was his death at a safe speed on a straight road in good weather really an accident? Do the conspiracy theories regarding the role of the KGB in his death actually hide the real conspiracy? Did a covert group of academics belonging to an intellectual society put that tree in the path of that car? In the philosophical and intellectual societies are not free of conspiring, nor are they free of theories of conspiracy. In the early 2000s, Jim Marshall writes, there was a theory that postmodernist conspirators had been conspiring to infiltrate teacher education to bring down democracy. More recently, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I was one of many academics invited by email to join with conspiracy theorists who argued that our Royal Society is conspiring against academic freedom. Some members of the Royal Society are concerned that they, the members, cannot tell people what counts as science and believe that there is conspiring going on. Now, I'm going to add to this onion of conspiracy theories. By the way, you can have a conspiracy of ravens. I think you have an onion of conspiracy theories. These academics crying conspiracy are conspiring to divert attention from the actual conspiracy, the one which continues attempt, more or less effectively, to silence ways of knowing. More on that soon in Georgina's session, in which Georgina puts powerfully to us that it falls to those of us in the academy who care about these things to make a stand for truth and science when racism masquerades as scholarship. Okay, and on that note, that's what PESA is all about. So I'd just like to briefly finish with a few thanks as a newly nominated Fellow of PESA. Firstly, I'd like to thank Sonia, Rachel, Liz, Andrew and Mark for nominating me. I'd like to thank Nesta, Georgina and Leon for inviting me to contribute to the organisation of many PESA conferences. And I'd like to thank all of the many PESA conference organisers. The reason I'm thanking you all is because that creates the space for us to do what it is that Georgina asks us to do. I think PESA keeps the philosophy of education alive, and it keeps alive fellowship and our spirit. I want to thank John Oslands for one sunny day in Fiji walking a Razorback Ridge with me. I want to thank Bruce Haynes for, back in 2003, inviting me to hand over a $50 note for my conference fee and thereby conscripting me to the society, and then for all the collegiality and humour that Bruce has provided that is part of being PESA. I also want to thank in particular Michael Peters and Peter Roberts for welcoming me into the philosophy of education, into the ways in which they inspire so many of us to be part of this society and to make this space full and rich and allow us to be ourselves as philosophers of education. Obviously, I also have to thank Jim Marshall, the late Jim Marshall, because he's always reminded me that there's no singular me to be. So I can be many things in this society. I'd really like to thank, who aren't here, Richard Herod and Sandy Farquhar, for holding my hand into the society as a student who thought of themselves as maybe being able to perform in a policy analysis space, in a politics of education space. It was filled with self-doubt back in the early days of this idea of myself being a philosopher of education. And finally, to our dear friend Peter Fitzsimons. You asked me to be on the executive of PESA, and did so whilst I was drunk and hungover in an AGM in Sydney. That kind of humorous invitation was one that neatly sidestepped my ability to say, no, I don't think I'm cut out for it. He knew I was cut out for being hungover and not listening to the AGM. So I woke up at the end of the AGM and I was on the exec. So thank you, Peter. Right, that's me.
Thank you, Andrew, so much. I'd like to open up now to everybody. We have some time for questions to Andrew. Conversation, dialogue, tissues. You all right? Yeah, removal of hats.
Oh, yeah, maybe the hat was making me cry.
Crying's good. Suzanne.
I want to ask you, Andrew, what conspiracy theory was the hat protecting you from?
Good question. I don't know. The good thing about the hat is it's just a generic, like if there's a conspiracy theory flying by, I'm well prepared for it. It's a good point. I think maybe if you know what's coming your way, you don't need the hat.
Well, we all need a hat then.
Yeah.
That's a great opening, Suzanne.
Can I ask a question?
Christoph, yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. That was very insightful, and I love your way of presentation as always, connecting pop fiction and science fiction and everything, pop culture and everything into your academic work. One thing that I was wondering in this context of misinformation and conspiracy theories around COVID is where are maybe the limits of critical thinking? We are upholding critical thinking so strongly in education and making it part of the curriculum in schools and talking about it all the time and everywhere without maybe always defining what we mean by that. And some of the conspiracy theories seem to come out of maybe an overshooting of criticality of established organizations. And I wonder if there's maybe something that goes too far or a misunderstanding of critical thinking. So how do you see the relationship between that and conspiracy theories against the state or established organizations?
That's a great question. I think, like if I look at one of Karen Barad's conversations around the limits of critique, there's a recognition that a discipline of critical thinking opens up questions, but then kind of hesitates to go further. And Barad argues for deconstruction. She turns to Derrida as a way of moving on from the limits of critical thinking. So I'm going to agree with you that what's created is maybe a narrow understanding of the task of the critical thinker that doesn't explore and work through notions of deconstruction. So that's perhaps part of the conspiracy theory curriculum that we have to add.
Yeah, Michael.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I was having trouble trying to get the video started, the unmuting function working. But look, thanks, Andrew. A lovely mix of humour and also, quite tearful with Peter's, terrible cancer that he's suffering. So, I wanted to say, first of all, a word in relation to Peter and his brother, Patrick, who have been really very, very supportive of PESA and done tremendous amounts for them, and not only inducting you into the society, but they held a lot of different roles, back in the old days, so to speak, of PESA, I just wanted to say that was a great note to end on. But I wanted to say something else here as well, because, I mean, Jim Marshall was inspired to say these things. And he was greatly inspired by Michel Foucault in saying them. In some ways, he was a translator for Foucault in New Zealand. And I think when we think about Foucault, we think also about biopolitics. And biopolitics in relation to conspiracy theory. And also, can I say, government by conspiracy, by the thousands of lies that, for instance, Donald Trump delivered in his final year as president, 36,000 fact-checked lies. You can call them conspiracies. These are lies. This was a process of government by conspiracy, and he's hanging around in the background. 2 years coming up to the election of the next US president. He did so much damage. He drew on white supremacist movements, and I think that's an appropriate context for a curriculum on conspiracy. We've got to get tough around questions of politics as well, because New Zealand secular curriculum, not allowed to talk about religion, not allowed to talk about politics, not allowed to talk about any contentious matter, really. Let's just keep it on the straight and narrow. And I'm wondering what you might say to that.
I see that in welcoming the new teacher educators into a teacher education program, and a total discomfort with having those kinds of conversations. So, this I think is the purpose of, starting with the New Zealand curriculum, but perhaps recognising that children before school in early childhood centres are already having these kinds of conversations in awesome ways. They're preparing themselves for those questions concerning truth and inclusion and politics and rights and freedoms. That every element of a 3-year-old's conversation with their peers and with their teachers is full of those opportunities, and these things then get sort of they're left to die from the ages of 5 to 17 if the curriculum has anything to do with it. I'm being unfair to school and to school teachers, of course, and I'm sure Nesta will tell me off for that. What I want to say, I guess, is you see the effects of that for most students when they arrive as a beginning teacher with the desire only to know how to control a class, to produce some assignment outcomes, rather than to engage in deep conversations about these things. And so when you introduce to student teachers the politics and sociology of education in their first year, it's a real shift, it's a real dissonance that doesn't make sense to the conversations they'll be having in social media and maybe even around the dinner table if such a thing exists. So that's, there's this gap that needs to be addressed with this curriculum, I guess. And I know in the United States right now, if we were to suggest that we start talking about conspiracy theories in the curriculum across various states in the United States, that's not going to really cut the mustard, because you can't talk about anything critical there. That was a very terrible generalization, but in some states, in some school systems. So we've got some work to do.
Thank you. Let's hand over to Peter.
Thank you. Yeah. Coincidentally, I picked up Camus' Outsider the other night as bedtime reading, and
was it coincidence?
I don't know. I'm about to ask, maybe.
Yeah.
So, and I've only a couple of chapters in, and I'm starting to empathise with the character, having a little bit of autism myself. I'm just wondering whether you think I should be optimistic or pessimistic after I finish the novel about our current malaise.
I'm going to say optimistic because you've read a beautiful novel, and a novel that challenges us to think about how societies cope with difference, how Mousseau is forced into hoping the guillotine actually, oh, hold on, how far through are you?
I'm only 2 chapters in.
Okay, optimistic.
Good.
And then read the myth of Sisyphus as well, because I think in the myth of Sisyphus there's this question concerning the quantity of life that we lead once we've realised, once the screen's gone down and we've realised the absurdity of existence. In the myth of Sisyphus, there's a character that maybe we could write into that myth. Camus explores a range of characters, an actor and a lover, and one could be the conspiracy theorist. And the task of the conspiracy theorist, faced with the absurdity of our condition, is to get onto as much conspiracy theorizing as possible. That seems counterintuitive, but I think it's inviting us to think carefully about how we optimistically deal with the absurdity of or the lack of meaning in life.
Thank you very much. I should say that these novels have been sat in my library since the 70s, and it's only since I've retired that I've got the time to read them. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Fantastic. Thanks, Peter. That's an enviable time to get to. Andrew, thank you so much again. Congratulations again. Do you have a couple of final words, anything that you want to finish off on before we move on to our second keynote?
Thank you, everyone.
You're done.
Be careful out there. Actually, I know what, I'll promote something. So we're Policy Futures have kindly offered an encyclopedia of entries on intergalactic pedagogy. There's the first article of which includes a few entries as a taster. So if you're interested in science fiction and education and pedagogy, have a look at that, and then send us an entry, and we'll pull together some powerful, strong, purposeful, but also fun, playful, and comedic analyses of what the unimaginable future of life in the universe means for education now.
Perfect.
There was me having nothing to say. Thanks.
See, I knew you'd have something. Excellent. Thank you. All right. So thank you, everybody, for your time and for listening in. We're going to move now to our second keynote, Melita Hogarth. I have very great pleasure in introducing Melita, who is a Kamilaroi woman and the Assistant Dean Indigenous and a Senior Research Fellow in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Prior to entering academia, Melita taught for almost 20 years in all 3 sectors of the Queensland education system, specifically in secondary education. Melita's interests are in education, equity, and social justice. Her PhD, titled Addressing the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Education, a Critical Analysis of Indigenous Education Policy, was awarded both the QUT and Faculty of Education Outstanding Thesis Awards, and was awarded the Ray Debus Award for Doctoral Research in Education. Melita's keynote is titled COVID Feels Familiar. Melita, I'm thoroughly excited to hear your presentation and really, really happy to have you here. So handing over to Melita now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Ginea Bayami Warangalo Winan Galanya Maranea Winingalanya Maranduandi Nile Marabala Bada Niani Burumbala Niani Nuale Niani, Yanalanda, Duanda Ninu, Yama Nindali, Militanea, Gamilarina. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Almighty Creator Spirit and the ancestors whose lands I am on. And I ask the Creator to bless and protect us while we're here on their lands and acknowledge the lands that you're all coming in from. So hello, I'm Melita. I'm a Gamilaroi woman and I thank you for attending this virtual space. I pay my respects to the elders past and present and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm speaking from, the Wadawurrung peoples. I acknowledge that this land has never been ceded, nor the sovereignty. I also acknowledge that I'm here because I stand on the shoulders of giants. My thank yous to all who have worked so hard to allow opportunity for Aboriginal peoples to engage in education in any capacity, of the mentorship and collegiality that I have been so privileged to receive from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples since making the huge step of leaving the classroom. To my Year 10 class that I still am accountable to, and their babies and their babies' babies, I hope that the words that I share today continue to emulate my desire to effect change in the provision of education for Indigenous peoples across this nation and act as a provocation for starting a conversation. This presentation comes with a caveat. I'm tired. After 2 years of physically being locked down, screen time, and no real interaction with academic minds in true conversations, you know, that space. This presentation may feel ill thought through and lacking true consideration at the depth that philosophizers may wish, but it has, however, made me think, and for that I'm grateful. I thought I'd begin by unpacking my abstract. The theme of this conference asked the question, how does COVID-19 feel? And my response from the outset is that COVID-19 feels familiar. So let me explain. I make the assertion that we as Indigenous people have seen and known this nemesis before. That we have seen and known, and in that I mean we have felt and been subjected to the diseases brought to our shores and countries via boats. So let's look at this statement first from a historical, political, cultural, and social lens. The impact of 1788 on Aboriginal communities is not just written as the usurpation of unceded lands, but also the severe disruption of Aboriginal society through the introduction of epidemic disease causing immediate loss of life. Two of the three main reasons for the dramatic population decline speak to the acquisition of Indigenous lands and the direct and violent conflict with the colonisers, factors all relating to the present or the process of invasion or colonisation. The final reason was the introduction of new diseases. The wave of epidemic diseases, including smallpox, measles, and influenza, spread quickly and annihilated communities. And in particular there, note influenza. Our lungs were susceptible from the outset to the respiratory diseases introduced. It is estimated that between 1788 and 1900, the Indigenous population of Australia was reduced by 90%. But of course, 1788 was only the beginning or the first of many waves of influenza viruses that threatened us. Kamilaroi man, Des Crump, and my uncle, Properways, shared in the Queensland State Library blog that the Spanish flu in 1919 saw over 12,500 lives claimed in total. Gordon Briscoe, in his doctoral thesis, identified that at least 30% of the Queensland death toll were known to be Aboriginals. In his final report in 1919, the Chief Protector of Aborigines in Queensland shared that 600 Aboriginals in Barambah, now known as Cherbourg, contracted the disease with 87 deaths reported. Taroom in central Queensland had over 200 affected, resulting in 31 deaths. It's good to remember that Queensland or any of the Aboriginal missions were quite small in number, with in particular Taroom in 1919 totaling some 400 residents. So over half of the community were infected with the disease. My great-great-grandfather at Uraba, an Aboriginal mission via Booming near the Queensland-New South Wales border, was one of the 54 recorded at the station, comprising of about 100 Aboriginals. So he was one of the 54 deaths. This century has seen several influxes of variants of influenza. The National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, in their News Alert blog, shared that in 2009, the H1N1 influenza virus, otherwise known as the swine flu, ravaged Indigenous communities. Pitjantjatjara and Nukunu man Professor James Ward shared how an Aboriginal person from a central desert community was the first national casualty of that outbreak, with the Indigenous population ultimately suffering death rates 6 times higher from that crisis than the general population. In The Guardian in 2013, Oliver Millman wrote that the H7N9 influenza virus was a strain of the H5N1 influenza virus, otherwise known as the bird flu, again saw Indigenous peoples at risk. Researchers found that Indigenous peoples were far more susceptible to the virus than any other Australian, finding that the prevalence and responsiveness of virus-killing T cells, key in natural immunity, varied within ethnicities. They found that while 57% of Caucasoid people had a robust T cell response to the virus, just 16% of Indigenous people in Australia and North America had the same protection. In other words, our biological adaptations to the introduced diseases is much slower. Catherine Kurziker, at the time, who was an associate professor at the Uni of Melbourne's Department of Microbiology and Immunology, shared how Indigenous people lacked a key protein needed to fight the virus, with their historical isolation making them relatively ill-equipped to deal with new viruses. They continued, stating, Caucasians have the most immunity because they have adapted to flu viruses and developed mechanisms to fight them off. Indigenous people don't have that. Fast forward to early 2020, and there were murmurs coming out that a new influenza virus was being detected. So while the first strain of the severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, which is an airborne virus, was detected in 2003, in 2020, we now have SARS-CoV-2, or more commonly known as COVID-19. Perhaps you now see why I state that COVID-19 feels familiar. We as Indigenous peoples have seen and known this nemesis before. My assertion that we as Indigenous peoples have felt and been subjected to disease brought to our countries via boats was a tongue-in-cheek jab at how influenza was brought to our shores and ourselves in 1788 via boat, and the now infamous docking of Ruby Princess in Sydney in March 2020, which saw about 2,650 passengers disembark and ultimately linked to at least 900 infections and 28 deaths. A report for the BBC News shared that a subsequent inquiry found that there was no systemic failure, but had been a mischaracterization of the ship as low risk. By August, after the said inquiry, the then Premier Gladys Berejiklian apologised for the mistakes made. The apology, in hindsight, at perceived mistakes made by government is ironic when we consider the long-awaited apology for the stolen generations in 2008. It feels as though when the risk and impact affects wider Australian society, it appears an apology is easily proffered. As I said in the abstract, the irony of the current experience is not lost on us. And I should highlight these experiences are not just experienced in the Indigenous populations here in Australia. The impact of colonisation on the social and health determinants of Indigenous peoples are found around the globe, as has been discussed and reported by several First Nations academics and registered nurses in their article in the Journal of Clinical Nursing, representing Indigenous nurses from Australia, Aotearoa, Canada, the United States, and Central America. I think it'd be redundant, given this audience, to then speak of the relationships between health, societal factors, such as racism and so forth, with education. You see, and this is where the crux of this contemplation is going. COVID-19, influenza viruses, respiratory diseases, they're all just an extension of the act of colonizing and has a significant impact, effect, and affect on our bodies, minds, and general well-being. Interestingly enough, through my readings in preparation for this presentation, I learnt that there is a reference to colonization in health in regards to disease. That is, according to Gale Encyclopedia of Medicine, colonization is the presence of bacteria on a body surface, like on the skin, mouth, intestines, or airways, without causing disease in the person. So let me repeat that. Colonization is the presence of bacteria on a body surface, like on the skin, mouth, intestines, or airway, without causing disease in the person. So stick with me here. The definition of colonization, according to the Merriam Dictionary, is the act or assist or instance of colonizing, such as the establishing of a colony, subjugation of people or area, especially as an extension of state power to the act of or practice of appropriating something that one does not own or have a right to. So let's consider this just for the moment. If in health and disease, colonization is seen as the presence of bacteria on a body surface, and if we were to consider colonization as the practice of appropriating something that does not own or have a right to, and if we consider country metaphorically as body surface, then the bacteria could very well be seen as the colonizers, and the presence of said bacteria on the skin, mouth, intestines, or airway could easily then be identified as the ways colonization impacts on us. Through our skin, through our mouth by denying our languages and insisting we speak English, through our intestines where our diets and food sources were changed, causing obesity and diabetes. And let's not forget the laced flour and tea. And through our airways, where our lungs are not able to adjust to the respiratory diseases brought to us through colonization. The bacteria in the health definition apparently causes no harm if they remain on the skin. But if they're transferred to another site, this is where infection may occur as it invades and multiplies in the body tissues of the host. Therefore, COVID feels familiar, an extension of the act of colonizing, that is through coming to Australia in 1788. The bacteria or organisms did not stay on the skin, but quickly moved, invading and multiplying in the body tissues, and shifted from the context of colonization to infection, causing country and its peoples to be unwell. Interesting fact here, viruses are different to bacteria. Bacteria are germs that can be treated with antibiotics. Viruses can't be treated with antibiotics. So does this mean that there's no antibiotic to colonization? Anyway, this time round in 2020, we were wiser and we knew this nemesis. It was March 11, 2020, that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. But the Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance Northern Territory Aboriginal Corporation did not wait for WHO, as in the World Health Organization, to reach this decision. By the 6th of March 2020, they had already had several discussions on the preparations and actions necessary to be undertaken to prevent the spread of COVID-19 to their communities. They had shared the necessity to keep your hands clean. They had discussed the importance to self-isolate if possible. They had spoken to the need to wear a face mask so as not to spread the disease or the virus. Those on the APY lands in South Australia had already gone to the extent of introducing strict rules for entry to their lands under the APY Lands Rights Act. Our old peoples and the keepers of ancient cultural knowledge knew the vulnerability of the elderly and responded to protect the communities. The old people knew there was no messing around this time. Communities were shut down, and with those individuals working and living in towns and cities returning to homelands to return to country and to protect one another. The urgency of the situation, even in the very early days of COVID, were not sugar-coated, with Martin Jard warning in a BBC News article that an entire generation of elders could be wiped out if we allowed the virus to enter communities. The death toll, even among younger family members, would be far higher than for the rest of the nation. In fact, on the day that WHO was declaring a pandemic, Indigenous remote communities had already significantly reduced any unnecessary travel to remote communities. An article in The Guardian on the 11th of March 2020 spoke to the risk to remote Aboriginal people as severe. We, as Indigenous people, have seen and known this nemesis before. And yet perhaps the self-determined notion of locking down decisions made by those in community is a much better action than the triggering episodes of post-traumatic stress that have arisen for those older Indigenous peoples who still live on the missions and reserves. Being locked down again due to government intervention and legislation, as they were up until the early 1970s in the state of Queensland, is still in the lived experiences of a number of Indigenous Australians. In the early part of the pandemic, Shani Wellington in The Conversation reported on the Prime Minister's address in late March 2020, when he said that Indigenous people over the age of 50 were to stay indoors. In the same address, Morrison had stated that people, so general community, people aged 70 and over should stay at home and self-isolate for their own protection to the maximum extent practicable. These arrangements should also apply to those with chronic illness over 60 and Indigenous peoples over the age of 50. Hidden within these statements was the unsaid, the inequities prevalent in society experienced by Indigenous peoples as a result of colonisation, governmental control, and historical and political intervention with Indigenous peoples, the lack of service provision, and the impossibility to intervene and provide the necessary supports in education, health, and so forth, was hidden in the rhetoric. It all was unsaid. The Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, who was at the time a 67-year-old Noongar Yamaji and Wonki man, intended to work from home where possible, but due to his role as a cabinet minister, would be required to work from his electoral office from time to time. By late 2020, prior to this advice, the then 45-year-old Melita Hogarth had already started to explicitly work from home, because ain't no one going to convince me that COVID would stop at my door, and determined that I was 45 and not 50 and keep on moving. Colonisation and its neoliberal values have created an extractive, resource-based economies rather than building health, education, and other systems needed for sustainable development. Many have thought that the colonial era was over, but COVID has made this explicit. It has not. To finish, I leave this provocation. Neo-colonialism relies on the continued belief that former colonial rulers are superior in terms of expertise and societal values. Not only are such attitudes racist and xenophobic, they're illogical, and it represents a kind of overconfidence that has literally been deadly. So I repeat, COVID-19 feels familiar. We as Indigenous peoples have seen and known this nemesis before. We have seen and known, we have felt and been subjected to disease brought to our countries via boats. The irony of the current experience is not lost on us. It's an extension of the act of colonizing and has a significant impact, effect, and affect on our bodies, minds, and general well-being. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you some of my contemplations as I look at the types of discursive exchanges that have been brought to the forefront since early 2020. I invite your inputs to these discussions, because in this presentation, I've not even had opportunity to speak to the impacts on education. The challenges involved in this space will be monumental, but I'd like to think we're at a precipice where change and a means to effect change in education is possible to create a world in which we want to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Melita. Yes, there are so many questions, and I see lots of clapping going on. We have some time for questions and for engagement with those or other questions with Melita, so I'd invite you now to join me, the participants, and perhaps put your hand up if you have a question. I'm going to try and keep an eye on the two screens that I see. Yeah, Michael.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating, really important speech. And I think, you know, the fact that we see colonialism only at a political, not at a micro-organistic level is extremely important, particularly because those old world pathogens that originally came from Europe that decimated not only the peoples, indigenous peoples in Australia, but also Māori. Mm-hmm. You know, chickenpox, measles, the old world pathogens wiped out Māori to a point where in the 1900s, by the 1900s, they were seen to be a dying race. And, you know, we often forget about the microorganistic level. And I think, you know, the beauty of your talk was to make the concept of viruses and bacteria and of course vaccines and so on, an integral part of a Western medical model that systematically ignored Indigenous people as part of its colonizing process. So, you know, you did a great service to us in that respect, and I commend you on your efforts.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael. You just made me think about the fact that I spent 10 years working out on community and in an old Aboriginal mission in central Queensland. And the old people there would often say that the viruses and the diseases were in the dirt because we historically, that was where the gunyahs would sit and so forth. And it was always interesting when the winds would start blowing, the old people would say that you watch, the kids are about to get sick. And it was that blowing around of the dirt and the dust. And suddenly the respiratory diseases were just unbelievable. So thank you for reminding me of that story.
Great. Further questions, anybody? Georgina, is your hand up?
Yes, it is. Yes, kia ora, Sonia. And kia ora ki a koe, Melita. It seems like a long time since we saw each other in Brisbane in December 2019. Lovely to see you again. And thank you, Michael, for... Yeah. I just want to respond to Michael in the way that he has sort of brought together a few themes there in terms of conspiracy theories, because, you know, colonialism is a lot about conspiracy theories. And actually, Michael, that idea that Māori were about to die out was based on the racist belief that Māori would naturally die out as an inferior race in the presence of the stronger British stock. And hence we have One Tree Hill, the monument erected to the dying Māori race. But of course, and it's really interesting to me that the Māori race was said to reduce to a nadir at around 1900, But I always wonder who was counting and on what grounds were they counting people as either Māori or European. But Melita, to come back to your kōrero, your talk, your koho, your lecture to us this afternoon, you know, and you really made me think about the way in which Indigenous peoples do identify so strongly with the lands that they're on, and the way that colonisation, which you've made a very nice connection there. But, you know, when Europe expanded and went global, you know, I mean, that really was the beginnings of globalisation, which of course is part and parcel of why this virus has become a global pandemic. It began with the European expansion into lands that were not theirs. And so, for instance, in Aotearoa, the creation of New Zealand in Aotearoa by the British was a colonisation of the land, which in many ways the Indigenous peoples were almost like side byproducts or collateral damage, I suppose you could call it. So just wanting to kind of pick up and weave together a few of those themes. And I think we could probably write a special issue of EPAC, Michael, about these themes. Kia ora.
Thanks, Georgina. I think it's interesting because those kind of myths of dying out, I shared stories, I think, across, you know, that kind of legacy of colonialism as well, because of, you know, there was quite often that referral, even when I was at school back in the day, that Truganini was the last of the Tasmanian Aboriginals, and yet we know that this is not true, and so this kind of idea around this superiority and exactly what you said, you know, that who was counting, who was, is really interesting. So, and thank you for sharing some of the experiences in Aotearoa, because I really do think it's a shared story. Our stories of colonisation may be very different, but the lived experiences, I feel there is shared experiences there from the impacts and effects of colonisation, if we call it colonisation.
And if I can just come back in there very quickly, and in my view, those shared experiences of colonisation are what give meaning to the term Indigenous.
Very much.
Anybody else wanted to contribute to that? Yep, Carl.
Kia ora, Melita. Thank you so much for your talk. It's been wonderful to listen to. I know you and I have had a couple of email exchanges, but we haven't met yet. But it's great to meet you, even on this platform. I just have a really kind of speculative question, and I don't know if you've got any thoughts about this, and I don't know if I do, but do you think we traditionally, your people, along with my people, I guess, might have thought of a virus as something completely different to how the medical model determines it? And I'm not just talking about a different name or whatever, but a different ontology, a different metaphysics.
Oh, nice question. And nice to meet you too, Cal, face to face, so to speak. That's a really interesting question, and that's, you know, I would probably say that more than likely, you know, we can't say that there was no viruses or anything prior to that, you know, gastro and all of those sorts of things. And so it'd be interesting, I don't know how you do it, but to find out the ways in which these kind of stories were shared across community, because there was, you know, there's practices that hark back to, you know, if someone was sick, removing them from community and having one individual care for them and so forth. So they were aware of these kind of these sorts of situations and what needed to be done. And I like that kind of thing about spirituality and the ideas that could come from that, from the unseen and the stories that is shared, the physical and the non-human and that connection, particularly to country. And yeah, oh goodness, now I'm gonna have to go do some reading.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd say, oh, do you know?
No, but now you're getting me really thinking.
They occupy two different worlds, so we might not have had a problem with a virus. It might have been a relation.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just speculating there. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm going to have to go see things.
Maybe talk later about it or something.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Might actually become a special issue.
Yeah. Watch out. I think Peter's got his hand up there, Sonia.
Peter, sorry, I didn't see you. I've got two screens, so I'm keep missing people.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, I fear that the viruses may mutate to a point that our current panacea won't work, and I read into what you said, Melita, that the response in Indigenous communities wasn't dependent on vaccination; it was dependent on practice. And I just wondered if there has been, to your knowledge, any dialogue between the health authorities on investigating whether these practices should be more widely used.
Good question. Thanks, Peter. I am not aware of these kind of conversations that are happening, but you know, the various, it's quite obvious that the virus will mutate. The various variants that are coming in, we're all learning the Greek alphabet as we go. But I think that see, we're kind of at a crux now in Australia where the Indigenous communities were quite successful in the beginning of the pandemic, but slowly but steadily, with things opening up, we now have COVID within communities, and it did spread like wildfire. The way in which it spread was ridiculous. I think in regards to response on practice or the ways that health and so forth, I really think from an Indigenous perspective, when it comes to these sorts of, and now that we've had this pandemic and we're in a society where we can exchange ideas so readily via technology, that there truly needs to be this kind of holistic approach to the ways in which we approach Indigenous affairs, in that the spread of COVID within those communities, so in central New South Wales and now it's in the Northern Territory as well, that it kind of highlights the complexity around the types of service provision for Indigenous people. We have households where there's 20 to 30 people in one home, and access to water, you know, those sorts of things. The mere idea of trying to isolate an individual within a household of 20 to 30 people is just illogical. And so I think there needs to be this kind of conversation of not just health having a conversation, or not just education or housing, but everyone coming together as a collective. And I think this kind of makes me think of the Uluru Statement that we have here in Australia that's currently being discussed, but unfortunately was dismissed by our current political party in power. That part of that Uluru Statement, one of the recommendations is a voice to Parliament. So not trying to break down those silos of this is my field, but having that more holistic view of what can be the solutions, and with Indigenous people, and not just telling Indigenous people what happens. So I think there's opportunities that are there if only they were considered rather than instantly dismissed.
Thank you, Tom.
No, I'm probably overlooking hands again in the two screens. So please call out if you have a question. Melita, in the meantime, I just wanted to know, you mentioned at the end before we went into questions that you hadn't got into the discussion of education or the effects and affects on education of what you've been saying. And I just wondered, this is clearly an orientational kind of shift that we're talking about here. And going back to Andrew's talk and the importance of the really early years that some of us work in, that would be the area where I can see the most important shifts going on. Is there something that you'd specifically say or ways that you work with in educational environments, for those of us who are in academia, that would be your utopian vision here?
Oh goodness. Okay, now we're getting into my area.
Great. I'm glad I work with you.
When it comes to education policy, particularly in Australia, I'm not sure about other colonial states, but in Australia, we do have specific policy around the introduction of Indigenous knowledges within our teaching and learning for schools. And so, and it kind of harks back to my response to Peter as well, in that whilst education and the closing the gap, I think we've got 2 to 3 actual targets, but that's always trying to kind of harks back to Georgina's statement, in that where the target or the standard that Indigenous students are supposed to get to is set by a non-Indigenous standard. So where the gap is that Indigenous aren't meeting the non-Indigenous standard. I like to flip that kind of story and always talk about the fact that we have a cultural gap, in that non-Indigenous people don't know Indigenous histories and cultures. It's not been taught in education, and it's not been shared readily. It's only been in the last 10 years that in Australian education policy that it's become kind of part of policy, even though back in the 1960s and 1930s, Uncle Jack Patton, in his speech in the Day of Mourning, was also calling for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges within teaching and learning. And so I've been working with Professor Marcia Langton around the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander curricular project that she started in 2017 through an kind of remit through the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet here in Australia. And primarily my goal is to affect change in education. So I'm getting to a stage, I'm about to write this chapter in my head. I'm about to write a chapter called Why I Don't Talk About Indigenous Education Anymore. In that, I think by constantly talking about Indigenous education, we're creating that binary of Indigenous education being separate to rather than built in. And so for me, it's about ensuring that teachers, academics, education stakeholders recognize that the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges, histories, cultures, languages into education should just be normalized. It should just be something that we do as educators. You know, I was asked, because my undergraduate degree was in arts, in tech, so wood shops and so forth, or manual arts we called it as well. They introduced a design brief within that curriculum back in, oh goodness, the early 2000s. And because of my my study of arts and design briefs, I actually taught manual arts for a year. So I was in a wood shop with year 8 students, teaching them how to use a drop saw and so forth, because that was part of the teaching and learning. Now, I didn't say I can't do that because I'm not trained in it, but teachers seem quite happy to say that they can't teach Indigenous knowledges because they didn't learn it at school themselves. There's this kind of massive wall that comes up. And I think COVID in particular has made these kind of inequities in education more prevalent, because we had schools that were, I can recall an article in The Guardian about, I want to say Cabbage Tree Primary School, but I probably got the name wrong, that has a significant Indigenous student population at the school. And when the lockdown happened, the education systems all said that they would send out dongles to provide opportunity to have access to the internet. That school was actually still waiting after the lockdown was raised. So there's clearly these kind of these barriers and challenges that just became really, really explicit with COVID. And so when everyone keeps saying, let's return back to normal, I don't want it to return back to normal. I want to learn from what has become so explicit in this time. And I'm not answering a question. I'm just getting up on my platforms now.
But there are so many other factors that we can, I'm sure, have lots and lots more conversations about. And yeah, everybody here can engage with you further if they.
Please do, Carl. Carl and Georgina, I need to talk about this idea. And Michael, about the old world pathogens and in the yeah. I can see a special issue, but anyway. Not that I've got time, but hey.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at the time, and I am going to thank you both, Andrew and Melita, for provocative and engaging talks. Thank you so much. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a 25-minute break to come, or a little bit less actually, 20 minutes break, to come back at 2 before we return to enter into the Zoom rooms to engage with the conference presenters and their presentations, which you've had an opportunity to have a look at over the past, I think, week and a half. So when we get back from the break at 2, you'll be able to choose which Zoom room you wish to enter. Just note that you will have time to enter all 3 of them after each other. So you will have an opportunity to engage with all presenters. Just by choosing one, it doesn't mean you're going to miss out on the others. In each session, we're going to have 25 minutes of discussion with a moderator in each room and the presenters, which you can see on the program. After 25 minutes, Basil is going to let you know that it's 5 minutes to move around. And at that time, if you wish to move to another room, you can go then. And then there'll be 5 minutes to move around, and then the next 25-minute session. Daniela.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to note that in my session, there are 4 presenters, so the timings are going to be slightly different, just so that there's equity between the 4 presenters.
And I will, if you're looking at your program, I will just also let you know that one of the presenters has not been able to come. And I'm trying to get back to my program now, which I've lost on my screen. David Lundy has not been able to come. So in that session, which Sarah is moderating, there will be 3 presenters now. So if there are no further questions, Georgina, yep.
I'm sorry, I had a clash, so I couldn't come to the prep session. So is it like session 1, the first person, session 2, the second person in each breakout room?
It's kind of designed to fit together in a particular topic. So it would be more like a conversation in each session, a conversation with all 3 or 4, rather than one then the other.
Not actually presenting, we're just doing the Q&A bit. Okay.
Yep, so engaging with the presentation that you've previously put online.
Yeah.
And just talking around your topic.
And there might be, a minute or 2 just to reintroduce what you talked about, so that, because there is so much information, you'll get a few minutes to brief the participants about what you were talking about before you launch into the conversation.
Yeah. Any other questions before we hop off on a bit of a stretch your legs and grab some food break? Some lovely recognition of keynotes here in the side too. Thank you. And so to keep to time, I'm going to make a start. And so for participants, remember you can choose then to go into whichever breakout room you'd like to go into. And then there'll be a message from Basil after 25 minutes to let you know that it's now 5 minutes time for you to switch over to another one. The presenters will be in the same breakout room for the whole hour and a half. So you the participants have a chance to move from one to the other. So have wonderful discussions. Basil and I are going to be here in this kind of central spot if you have any difficulties or questions or anything like that.
Kia ora koutou, and it's my great pleasure to close this wonderful conference. I think that we will all agree that it was an incredible experience to be together in those breakout rooms and listen to those arguments and listen to those conversations, and just thinking, gosh, I wish we were all together in one room and having drinks, and now heading to the pub for the post-conference drinks and just enjoying and continuing those discussions. I have to say that I love the idea of breakout rooms, but it became sort of couch potato and just stayed in one because just the discussion was so amazing. And but I witnessed all three of them, and I have to say, Rachel, Daniela, and Sarah, what a wonderful moderation. And thank you so much for your work through those sessions. I mean, we all know how much work it took, and it's been great discussions, great teasing out those tensions and thinking about the current world within which we're living in. The session that I spent most time with was called Ethics, Trust, and COVID, and I think it was absolutely fascinating. And I have to say that there is one thing that's waiting for us, and that is a summer or winter for some of you. I apologize for that in the Northern Hemisphere. But and for us, what it means is that it's the end of the year. It's a summer vacation. We really hope this has been, and we talked about it, and I think someone actually, one of our keynote presenters actually mentioned it, that it's been such a difficult 2 years, and it's been difficult 2 years, and I think we all deserve a holidays. We all deserve a break from all academic arguments and from our managers at work and from workload discussions and everything else. And we all deserve just the time with us, with our families, and to enjoy the festive and holiday seasons. And when we come back, we really hope that 2022 is going to be a different year for PISA. We really have a high hopes, and I just have to emphasize again that we have the scheme that is called Bring Philosophy of Education Back to Our Campuses. And we know that the times are changing as the Australia and New Zealand are opening up, at least locally or statewide. So there are opportunities to involve our doctoral students and to create opportunities to engage with. So please do go back to that newsletter from October, and in the most recent newsletter, in the next newsletter, we will emphasize it again. I apologize for that crying. I just have a little bit of emergency with my children, not with cats, but with real children. That it's been sort of back and forth this afternoon. And the last thing that I want to say is that thanks to Sonia, to Daniela, to Rachel, to Bernadette, to Andrew for really organizing this event. It went so smoothly, but actually it was actually quite a lot of work to organize that, and I'm just so appreciated. And Carl, of course, I forgot Carl. I'm so sorry. There you are. It's been just great to see how when we put together our minds, what we can achieve, even though we can't be together in person. And again, congratulations to our doctoral scholarship winner. Congratulations to our PISA book winner. Congratulations to our new PISA fellows. It's a wonderful to celebrate our successes and to see how we can collectively leave this year behind and collectively move towards 2022 and see what it can bring. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful break, and see you in 2022. Thank you for your support of PISA. It is our intellectual home, and it is what we made it. Thank you so much. See you next year. Thanks. Bye-bye.